Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth Green Minds webinar in our launch week. And today our theme is about taking a systems approach to nature-based solutions that restore nature, help us manage environmental challenges and support our communities. So I'm Jemma Sharman, I'm the project lead for Green Minds, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. I co-developed the Green Minds programme, so I'm really excited to see it coming to life and have so many people joining us today. So before we start, I've just got a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and we'll share it after the event. We've got 3 inspiring speakers today that I'm going to introduce shortly, and that'll be followed by a Q&A session at the end. So you'll see, I think, as you come in, there's a question and answer strand for you to post any questions that you've got, and we'll do our best to answer them. But also we'll be looking to follow up on some of those questions after the events as well. So before I hand over to our speakers, I just wanted to give a bit of context to today and introduce you to Green Minds. So Green Minds is a 3-year programme that's about testing that systems approach to nature-based solutions in Plymouth. We really want to put nature at the heart of our decision making and fundamentally challenge that our often existing attitudes and behaviours that we're independent from nature. We want to help create green mindsets. So this will be through delivering on-ground projects like our beaver reintroduction, rewilding of urban green spaces, tree planting, introducing wildlife ponds, to manage drainage problems, but also to experiment with different delivery and management approaches that help us support community stewardship and green enterprise. We want to use science and creative digital tools to bring nature to life. This will include a 3D immersive nature film that will make nature visible, and also to evaluate and impact and share our learning through action research studies and provide new resources and tools to help share that learning. And we can do this because we've got some great partners on board. So it's being led by Plymouth City Council with Real Ideas Organisation, the University of Plymouth, Devon Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, Plymouth College of Arts and the Data Place. And we're proud that this project is trying to take a different approach. We were the only UK city to secure funding from the European Regional Development Fund under its Urban Innovation Actions programme. So at the end of this webinar, we'll share some more links about how you can find out more through our new website, but also how you can get involved. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We've got 3 incredible speakers who have an awful lot of experience between them. Morag Watson is the Director of Policy for Scottish Renewables and also led the original Natural Change project as Policy Officer for the World Wildlife Fund. Rachael Bice is the Chief Executive of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and for 20 years worked in the public sector over the border in the Environmental Growth and Partnership Manager with Cornwall Council. She also helped pioneer Cornwall's approach to environmental growth. And finally, we'll have Gary Wallace, who's a specialist here in Plymouth in our office to the Director of Public Health at Plymouth City Council. And he's also an honorary university fellow at the Plymouth University Peninsula School for Medicine and Dentistry. He's got a long-standing interest in improving the commissioning and delivery of services for people with complex needs and multiple vulnerabilities. So over to our first speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Morag Watson.
Thank you very much and good afternoon everyone. It is lovely to be with you all this afternoon. So I will just share my screen with you so you can see my slides and we should be fine there. So as you heard in the introduction there, I used to work for WWF. I worked for them for 10 years and my job when I was with them was very straightforward. I was there to change government policy and legislation so it advanced sustainability. And WWF had a very logical way of doing this. We would identify the problem, then we would look for a solution, and we would then pull together a group of volunteers. We would run a pilot project to test that our solution worked. We'd then gather the evidence to show its effectiveness. And then what we'd do is we would hand it over to an independent body, usually academics or a university, who would assess that our findings were actually genuine and we didn't make them up. We'd write it all up in a report. We'd take it to the Scottish Government and they would look at it and go, oh, that's really interesting, thank you. And then nothing would change. Business as usual would just carry on. So this obviously was very frustrating with the urgency of both the climate and biodiversity emergencies. We just weren't making enough progress fast enough. So I was part of a team in WWF that went to look at this. We were investigating why did all this data and logical arguments not result in change. So we researched this for a long time. There's a team of us all working on it, and I can sum up all that research in 2 sentences for you. And here they are. Lots of people argue with this one, but I would just say to you, take a look at climate change. Lots of people know about climate change, but how they respond to it is entirely different. And this is all down to what people feel and believe about that knowledge that they had. And when we looked further, particularly into the sustainability side of this, we found that there were 2 key feelings and beliefs that underpin our whole issue with sustainability in our society. And this is them. We all intellectually know that we are part of nature, but we spend most of our lives in totally artificial environments, inside our homes, where every aspect of the environment is controlled for our comfort. So it is really, really easy to convince ourselves that all those rules that apply to all the living things out the window there don't really apply to us. So although we may know it, we don't really feel it and we don't believe it. And likewise, if we think about our actual genuine experience, and there's a huge pile of peer-reviewed scientific evidence around this, human beings are naturally kind and concerned for each other. We are social animals. We are evolved to get on with each other and cooperate. But if you look at what's going on in our media, the people who are promoted and celebrated for their success, it is very easy to believe that most human beings are selfish, self-serving and self-centered, because that's what we hear so much about in our society. And collectively, those 2 things set us up to fail in tackling sustainability. So at WWF, we came up with a radical new idea. And we asked ourselves, what if we stopped trying to convince people about sustainability through logic? What if we actually gave them the opportunity to experience themselves as part of nature and to feel what it's like to be in an environment completely shaped by the best in human nature and not the worst? So that's what we did, and that is how Natural Change was born. Now, there are actually 2 natural change projects. The first one was a communications project. This was back in 2008. Facebook was only 4 years old and social media was just getting going. And what we did is we brought together 8 people who were early adopters of social media and were just getting into this newfangled thing called blogging. And what we did is we took them on a series of 3 wilderness retreats, and we took them here. This is the Knoydart Peninsula on the west coast of Scotland. It is completely inaccessible by road. There's no way to drive in here. You can only ever get in by boat, or those mountains in the middle background there, you can walk for 24 hours through them and you can get to Knoydart. So we spent a week, 3 weeks in total on Knoydart, 6 months apart. And while we were there, we did various natural change practices to reconnect people with nature and reconnect them with their own human nature. And I don't have time today to go into all the things that we did, but those are all detailed on the Natural Change website if you're curious and want to know about it. And we were amazed by what happened. So the website of the blogs that we had got 58,000 views from 30 odd countries around the world. And back in those days, that actually counted as going viral. It barely makes a dent these days, but it was quite an achievement at the time. And we'd done no promotion of this. And the other thing that really, really surprised us was how activist the participants became. They hadn't been particularly interested in sustainability before, but all we said to them is, have this experience and see what you think of it. I'll take just one example. Louise MacDonald, who is and was then the chief executive of Young Scot, she became very fired up about this. They managed to reduce their organisational carbon footprint by 1/3 in a year. She integrated sustainability into the work of the Young Scot organisation. She joined the 2020 leaders group, which were working on achieving Scotland's 2020 climate change targets, and she argued with that group that actually by the time that we had to have really decarbonised our society 2050, all of the people on the 2020 leadership group would have retired. So she got them all to found the 2050 leadership group to support the next generation of leaders to come forward, and that group is still active in Scottish politics today. We then got ourselves thinking, what if we brought together a group of people to do this natural change thing, who all worked in the same sector and worked in a sector that was undergoing change? What would happen then? And the sector we chose was education, for a very simple reason. In Scotland at the time, schools education was going through its biggest overhaul for a generation, a process called the Curriculum for Excellence. Education in Scotland is also shaped by just 5 main areas of policy: the curriculum, inspections, teaching standards, which shape teacher training, the exam syllabus, and whatever government initiatives happen to be going on at the time. And all of those things were in a state of change. So we brought together a group of 12 people from across those different aspects of education. And again, we ran the second Natural Change project. It would take a very long time to tell you about all the things that happened, but I will simply conclude by saying Scotland went on to become a world leader in learning for sustainability in schools. We were the first country in the world to make learning for sustainability an entitlement for all children, and that includes outdoor learning. We were the first country in the world where teachers are legally obliged to be able to teach sustainability, to be able to be qualified as a teacher in our country, and we were recognised by UNESCO for the work that we've done. Now, this wasn't, of course, all down to Natural Change, but it was a very pivotal part of it and helped build a lot of the alliances and coalitions that made this happen. So that's a very quick rattle through how Natural Change got started. We then, as WWF realised that it had applications way beyond the work that we were doing. So what we did is we took Natural Change and we set it up as a charitable foundation and as a social enterprise, and that continues today. And this was to give many more people the opportunity to experience themselves as part of nature and experience what it is like to be in an environment completely shaped by the best in human nature and not the worst. The other speakers today will talk a little bit more about their experiences of this, but Natural Change continues to this day. We no longer go to Knoydart because the boats make it tricky. We now use the Allerdale Wilderness Reserve in the Highlands of Scotland as our main venue. And this is it here. That is Dinach Lodge in the middle of Allerdale Reserve, which we believe to be the remotest building on the UK mainland. So if any of you are curious about Natural Change and more of the detail, there's the web address there. You can find all the details of what we do and how it works and all the reports that were written around it on that. And likewise, I've put my email address there. So if anybody's curious and has any questions that don't get answered in this session, you can also just email me and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And I will stop there because I'm aware we have lots of speakers to get through and not as much time as any of us would like. So I will hand back over.
Many thanks, Morag. It's really inspiring stuff, and those pictures are just to die for of the mountains. So thank you. So Rachael, who's also been involved in the Natural Change programme, is going to share her experience of that, but also in the context of Cornwall Council as well. Welcome, Rachael.
Thank you, Gemma. Hopefully you can, coming up on people's screens and looking at those beautiful pictures of Scotland is reminding me what it was like to be there actually, and yeah, what a profound effect that it had on my life when I went to Knoydart, which is what I'm going to share a little bit about today, and what happened in consequence of that. So I sit currently in Yorkshire, but I've only just recently moved up here from dear Cornwall, next door to where many of you will be watching this from. And I previously worked at Cornwall Council as a started off humbly temping in the waste department, learning about the stuff that people do with the materials they don't want anymore, and slowly building up my knowledge and leadership skills to end up being as a reasonably senior manager at Cornwall Council, and now moving to Yorkshire to take up the reins of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, which is an immense privilege. But I suppose there's a question about how did that happen, and what steps were on the way. And I was a young person who loved animals, but I didn't necessarily locate those animals in nature. But as I learned more about my animals, a question came to me about I need to understand more about nature. And in doing that, I Googled that. And at the top of the search list, out came this thing called Natural Change, which Morag is just describing, the early projects. And it happened to be that the person who was pivotal in that lived in Cornwall at the time. And so I thought, oh, this has got to be a serendipity. I'm going to find out more about this. Well, that one Google search resulted in getting on the boat to Knoydart and going and having it being part of a training course for a week for natural change, and having that experience that Morag is talking about. And I'd never been anywhere so remote, and yeah, my sense of nature as an agent, as a being, as an entity, wasn't particularly well formed. But that experience enabled me to connect to myself in a new way, to connect to other people in a new way. Predominantly, I think there are two things that are important. One, when you feel vulnerable in the face of nature, it's a very different vulnerability to a social vulnerability. It asks you things, it challenges you things in a very physical and visceral way, and it reminds us that we are an animal being on this planet. And I think human beings have somewhat forgotten that we are just another species on this planet, to some degree, because we're too clever for our own good. The other thing that does, as well as that vulnerability to nature, it's also being held by nature, and that experience is quite profound. And the way I was trying to think about to articulate it for sharing it with you today is, in that softening of that vulnerability and that holding is also an immense strengthening that happens as a person, as a biological being on this planet. You think, why might that make a difference? Why is that important? That sounds very luxurious to go and have that experience. Well, for me, why do we do that is because the change that we all are aware that needs to happen in the world takes a tenacity that most of us can't maintain on a day-to-day basis, because it's really hard. You know, if it was easy, we wouldn't be in the crises that we were in. If it was as easy, as Morag was saying, as just telling people about things, things would change, but it isn't. It's around all of the societal structures, the systems, the beliefs, the values, the reinforcements that hold all of that system together. So if you care, and then you start to some degree be overwhelmed by the impact of, good Lord, how is little me going to make an impact into this system? You need, or I have felt that I have needed to find a different type of resolve, a different type of strength, of solace. And what I have done over the last 10 years, so that journey from temp in the waste department to being a leader at CEO level of a charity doing great things in the world, is find that support from nature. And I have learned to do that through the practices that I learnt through the Natural Change projects and the training, and being in the community that I am now privileged to know through those experiences. So how does that make change in the real world? So what that strength means, you recognise yourself as part of nature. So we have a unique place, and then you find that you are in a place. And what is your unique place in that place? And in your case, this is Plymouth that we're thinking about. So what are the unique roles that you're all playing in Plymouth that only you can play? And I think I found that position in Cornwall, and that particularly was related to when our local nature partnership was being set up. Cornwall didn't have an environment strategy at that point. I was very privileged that on that partnership were some very inspiring, passionate people, so I got to work in partnership with people. But ultimately I had to put the work in, and I had to dig much deeper in terms of effort than I ever had before in a working context. But because I was connected to my place, I knew how to connect to my place, which at that time was Cornwall. And I sort of could understand that we all have a place in the system, because that if you think systems thinking, we can't do it without everybody else. That means that all of us have to have a place in the solutions to changing it or making the change. So I really dug in, and I think there's a Gary Snyder quote that's of relevance that says, "Find your place on the planet, dig in and take responsibility from there." And I suppose that's what I did. And I went to nature when I was having a bad day. I went to nature when I was having a good day. I went to nature. And of course, you know, in the places that we're talking about, South Wales Peninsula, surrounded by beautiful nature and the sea particularly. And so we established a strategy. We managed to draw in many millions of pounds of investment under the basis of that strategy, some European funding, but other things as well. We managed to help our LEP understand the importance of nature. And this is sometimes when people don't understand what they need to do in their role to make that change. And what we found was that, and what I personally found, I suppose, is that the passion that I could bring, that I felt because I was rooted into something deeper, gave a different quality to the sort of conversations that I was brave enough, I suppose, to have with people that you wouldn't otherwise maybe talk about other non-human beings or the agency of nature or those things. So I was starting to use a language that wasn't necessarily normal, but touched something in people that reminded them of their vulnerability, their humanity, their care. And I did that from the incremental leadership positions that I have undertaken. And just yesterday, I was with the Yorkshire Water Board talking exactly about the same thing, about what about the non-human animals that the water company should be looking after, as well as the human ones. So that's a bit of a sense of the journey that I have been on. I'd be very happy to answer any questions around that. But I think that the reasons could go into all the different detail about what we did, but it's the personal resolve and understanding wherever you are, if you really deepen in to what you really care about and find the way to articulate that, it will make a change around you. And you might be surprised over a number of years how big a change that makes for the world and for your life, as I have been. So I'll leave it there and hopefully speak a little bit more in due course if there's questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate that kind of being not just a professional story, but a personal story. And I think that's a bit of a thread that goes through systems change and the kind of my growing understanding of it. And I really love that part about, you know, find your unique role in this, that we all have that unique role in Plymouth, to how we give nature that kind of voice and try and put it to the centre stage, as it were. So thank you. So now over to our final speaker today, Gary Wallace. You're up now.
Thanks, Gemma. I'm just going to share my screen. This is really what I'm going to be talking about is something which has developed so the council is divided into people and place. So a lot of this work has been developed in complex systems that revolve around people. And actually the application for it in place is about exploring the way people experience place. So these are the areas we've used this approach in. So essentially it's taking a human learning systems approach rather than a more traditional approach. So the case for doing that, essentially, so we work in a paradigm or model which is called New Public Management, and that makes lots of linear assumptions about how things happen in the world. It essentially came from companies which make widgets, and it was about 30 years ago we started to apply it in the public sector, and it's really focused on the 3 M's, markets, managers and metrics. But the evidence for it's really rather poor. So the way this would work typically is this is a typical kind of outcome-based performance management paradigm. The government would say we want fewer obese people. That will be translated into a strategic objective around BMI. So that's what's called a proxy measure. And we would then in Plymouth maybe have a target of reducing the BMI of 1,000 people, but by a certain margin. And then you'd probably construct a logic model where the idea is you stick money in one end and you go through a market process, you secure a service, and then actually you get lots of thin people at the other end. But actually, this is the foresight systems map for obesity. So there are 108 causes of obesity listed on here. You can see they're all interrelated. And the bit that we would be commissioning in Plymouth would be this tiny little bit here, healthcare and treatment options. And so the approach of new public management is essentially doomed to failure before it starts. And the other thing for us is it's also applied internally to staff, target-driven management and standardised approaches to care and work. And we've seen in COVID, with the exam fiasco and with the targets around testing, how actually that algorithmic or routinized approach really can't capture the breadth of human diversity and ultimately leads to things like retrenchment of services, gaming, creaming, parking, thresholds which deny people services. But it also significantly limits mastery, autonomy and purpose for staff, which we know are necessary for well-being at work. And you can really summarise that with these two quotes. So essentially the issue isn't the target themselves, it's the way we performance manage around targets. So it's fine to measure stuff if it's a learning tool, but when we start to really performance manage that, it causes all kinds of unlooked for problems. And the reason for that is these are the properties common to complex adaptive systems. The key point here is adaptive. So what that means is systems are in a constant state of flux. So if you're assuming that if you stick something into a machine here and you'll get a sausage out of the other end, it doesn't work like that because the interactions are non-linear and they can't be summed. We can't predict that A causes B. So complex is not the same as complicated. Rockets are complicated, they're made of millions of components, but we can predict reliably how those components interact. That is not the case with human systems. So to sum that up really, what I'd really highlight here, because we're limited for time, is a lot of our practice is routinized and it happens with little or no thought. And it's what this work we're doing in people systems and increasingly in place systems is about how we develop connection and cooperation between people and between people and nature. And it's about how you have a much more pluralistic, democratic construction of space. And some other things to kind of bear in mind, I understand there are people from other places. So the ideas around best practice is a fallacy because the system is always changing. So what's best practice today is not necessarily best practice tomorrow. Lift and shift is almost always a fool's errand. We've all tried to copy what happened really successfully in another city and it's not been so successful in ours. And the reason for that is because complex systems are different everywhere. So the key assets for us are experimentation, thoughtfulness and learning. And that's really what we've been trying to apply in parks and green spaces in Plymouth. So the alternative that we're experimenting with is called human learning systems. And that's about approaches based on relationships and trust, or being human to each other, being kind to each other. Morag mentioned that humans are naturally sociable and kind, and we're really just trying to kind of revalue that, to focus on continuous learning and adaptation because the world is constantly changing, and to take a systems approach, not a service approach. So if you think about your life or the lives of our vulnerable people, they are in contact with multiple systems and multiple services. It's no good just having a really linear siloed view about what they need and how we might provide that. It's much more about an inclusive arrangement with our citizens. And you can sum that up with the future is bespoke. So one of the methods that we use is a method called co-production. The point about co-production is it is not consultation. So consultation typically would be somebody comes up with a plan and they then ask people to comment on the plan. Co-production is about starting from where people actually are. So you're really trying to involve everybody who's involved in a system in envisioning or dreaming about how that system can be. And in this situation, we've been doing that work around green spaces. And a key tool in that is a thing called appreciative inquiry. So since the beginning of Green Minds and then actually in the Future Parks Accelerator, we've collected hundreds and hundreds of people's stories, stopping people in outdoor space and asking them, what they love about the space, what they would change about the space, what they'd like to see in the space, in a really kind of open and positive way. To really just to engage people and reconnect them with each other and with the places they love. And the way we do that is by, as a system, kind of generating really open questions, going out and asking those questions, and then we kind of reframe those from the person's perspective. So typically we would rewrite them in the first person. We read them aloud in groups because that builds empathy. And we also do all the kind of normal stuff as well about looking at research and how much money we've got and what data we have. And it's a repetitive process where we do this kind of inquiry or exploration until everybody in the system feels we've got a rounded understanding. And then we need to agree what we want to achieve. And that's really a process of relentless iterative discussion, referring back to the field work, talking to decision makers, going back to the people we spoke to, and then identifying ideas to prototype or experiment with. Now, we use the language of experiment and prototypes because the language of pilots has kind of got such a history. So typically, certainly in local authorities, you would spend months and months and months trying to eliminate any risk for a pilot. And by the time you implement it, the moment has passed. What we're trying to do is do things really quickly just to see what happens, what we can learn from that and what we can build on. Really the process is about continuously experimenting, continuously talking to our citizens, to our staff, kind of horizon scanning and experimenting in the light of the knowledge we gain. It's about the only real kind of thing we insist on is gathering learning. So it doesn't matter whether it's a learning from a failure or a learning from in inverted commas success. It's all learning, and really learning is the new currency for the way we're working in systems. And it's really about introducing thoughtful approaches to problem solving rather than routinized approaches to problem solving. The other thing to mention is that almost all the issues we encounter are cultural rather than structural. So a typical way large organizations tend to deal with change is to restructure, but actually the culture eats structure for breakfast. So we focus relentlessly on trying to build new culture together, to build new culture empathically between actors in a system. We try to reframe problems so that they're positive, so we wouldn't necessarily demonize things or people that don't agree with us. And really our role as leaders is to build new affiliations, to engage people in experiments, because experimentation is infectious, to build prototypes together, to co-design together, to integrate our delivery together. So it's about leadership rather than management. So leaders as learners, as teachers, as facilitators, as experimenters, as colleagues, and as servants to systems. I hope that was on time.
That was great. Thank you very much, Gary. You've all been perfectly timed. Well done. Thank you. It was really interesting. Obviously, we've been working with Gary in Plymouth now for the last year, and I think it was really interesting. One of the conversations we had was about kind of bringing the experience from people into place. And I think one of the very quick learnings we had is actually, people and place are not separate. They're one thing, and this concept of separating kind of nature out from ourselves, they're sort of reflected in that. So I think it's been really exciting starting working with public health about how we've started to join that people place mentality about actually this is a whole, and some really interesting thoughts there that have come through all of the presentations around that kind of culture, around our values, what values we hold socially, what values we hold for nature as well, and what kind of culture and values do we want to encourage and foster in Plymouth. So I feel really inspired by those. I was lucky enough, and Zoe, my colleague as well, to be part of the Natural Change programme about 10 years ago, Natural Change for facilitators. So it feels like there was a seed sort of planted 10 years ago that sort of we've kind of weaved our way through, and I definitely think has fed into our Green Minds programme, as well as some of the learning through public health as well. So it feels like it's taken a while to kind of sort of plant and grow, but we're at a point where we can really start to kind of share that learning that we've had ourselves as well. So we've got a bit of time for questions, which is great. So there are a few coming in. So to our first question, here we are. So I think this is perhaps to Morag. What advice do you have on how we can connect more young people to nature in cities and give young people the same sort of opportunities for outdoor adventures in the Southwest? So I think, and to me, this is also part of a wider conversation about how we, looking at the climate movement and young people and how they've engaged in it, how do we spread that in a more kind of broader nature sense as well?
So I did work with the Scottish Government on their education policy for 10 years. And a regular misconception that we came across when we were talking about outdoor learning was it was learning about the outdoors. So we started calling it, instead of outdoor learning, learning outdoors. So it was very much about doing everything, literacy, numeracy, all the subjects in an outdoor context. We also found that there was a big misconception that outdoor learning or learning outdoors involved a field trip. You had to go somewhere. So the model that we very much worked with was a sort of 3-tier model. So there's the places where you can just step outside your school building into your school grounds and be there. And that was the kind of learning you should be doing, as long as the weather cooperates, as much as possible, 2 or 3 times a week. And then there's the places that you can walk from your school ground within the context of a lesson. And we said, you know, about once a week for learning in those environments. And then maybe once a school term, you do go on that school trip where you go off somewhere to a new environment. And then in Scotland, we had the commitment that once in your primary school education, usually around primary 7, which in Scotland is sort of 10, 11 years old, you would have a residential week somewhere out in the countryside. And then again in secondary school, which is sort of 12, 13 onwards, a residential week. And that helps really shift the mindset from, oh, we have to hire a bus and take the children somewhere to do this, to thinking about it. Something that was also very instrumental in Scotland was the forest schools movement, which you don't need a forest to do, you just need outdoors. My sister does this with a nursery school on Orkney. Anyone who's ever been to Orkney knows they have almost no trees, so you don't need trees to do it. But again, it did give teachers a framework and the confidence for doing that outdoor learning. And that's what we found was the biggest barrier. Teachers were actually quite worried about taking children outdoors because of the behaviour management and the classroom management. But actually, once they had that training and that framework, it was not a problem.
Right, thank you. Just following up more on a kind of wider systems context. We have got a question here about what difference to changing your approach through natural change makes your relationship with the Scottish Government as well.
Yeah, well, I am still working with people in the Scottish Government that I worked with all those years ago, and it was very much the thing that Rachael said. My personal experience of natural change is I had a tendency to put on my professional mask. You know, you put on the professional outfit, you put on the professional persona, and it is in some ways not your authentic self. And what natural change helped me do was get over this terrible cultural thing that we have, that professional is logical and rational and emotional, and what you think and feel shouldn't come into the professional, which is a load of nonsense. So I stopped thinking of myself and the people I was working with in Scottish Government as our job titles, and we are human beings dealing with the complicated, messy business of being human and the complicated, messy business of a group of human beings trying to get together and work collaboratively to make something good happen. And it was that the changes in language are quite subtle. Things you stop saying I think and start saying I believe and I feel. And I've actually come across some really awful stuff around leadership, which have said, oh, if you want to be seen as assertive, think and feel are words that women use. Feel and believe are words that women use. Men say think. If you want people to take you seriously, don't talk about your feelings. Utter nonsense. The biggest pile of bullhickey I've ever come across. So really do push that one aside. The other one, and Rachael may smile at this, that I'm a bit infamous for, is my chocolate brownies, gooey chocolate cake. And I actually just thought one day, stuff this, you know what, I'm taking some home baking to a Scottish Government meeting. So I walked into Victoria Quay, which is the main Scottish Government building in Edinburgh, very formal, everyone's in a suit, pulls out the tin that's full of home-baked chocolate goodies. And you can see everyone in the room going, nobody brings home baking to these meetings, but oh wow, those look good, I really want to eat one of those. And when everyone's fingers are covered in sticky chocolate and you're all sort of and eating away, all that nonsense about status and hierarchy begins to go out the window, and you are people. And it was that real thing. And actually we did a huge amount of work, which my co-director of natural change, Osbert Lancaster, still leads with the Scottish Government around their climate conversations work, which is about shifting the work from knowledge to values and attitudes, and we've done a lot of work with the Scottish Government on that, and that has really changed around things. So now when you look at our green economic recovery stuff, which I'm currently working with the government on, it is about a just transition to an equitable zero carbon society, and that social justice, equality and well-being of people being fully integrated with the well-being of planet has been a really important shift that not just natural change but many other things have helped bring about.
Great, thank you very much, Morag. And one for Rachael, if you could give us 3 things to do when we leave this webinar to take steps and be brave for nature, what would they be?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I think there's something, whether this is exactly 3, I think there's something about in your everyday life being brave enough to literally connect with nature. So say hello to the tree. Actually, if you want to go up and give it a hug, do, because the more people that show that when other people are around, the more normalized it becomes. So we don't have these the oddness that some people would project onto those behaviours, which actually are the things that we really value in childhood, for example. You know, the things that we find magical, like bring that magic of nature and the relationship with nature into our adult lives. I think then the second thing, so if we actively do that, we start to engage in that particular way, we will then start to listen and receive from nature in a different way and pay attention to that. And again, it's around sharing that. So if you notice something, see that what that bird just did, or isn't that flower beautiful, when you're with others, again, sharing that, because often they will go, oh yeah, I didn't see that. And again, we're weaving it in all the time. And then I think, just reiterating that point Morag was making, the real bravery is about speaking about nature like you care in contexts that otherwise that wouldn't be spoken about. And I am well known that I have welled up with tears at various things because I feel really passionately about it. I do manage to bring them back down again. You know, that's a bit of a delicate art that I'm always teetering on the edge of. But it's, yeah, if you really deeply care, then show that deep care. But I think the skill that people that we need to find more of in our society is to do that from a to articulate that from a non-conflictual place, because I think that what often happens is that care is expressed and experienced by somebody else as being quite accusatory. It's about generally you're wrong, I'm right, that type of thing. Whereas if it can be expressed with curiosity about, I wonder if we could find solutions to this, I wonder if we could value that more, then I think that has a much more likely, the conversations take on a completely different tone then, and I think that is very powerful. So be brave enough to express yourself, but be committed enough, I think, to learn the skills about how to express that in a way that other people can hear and then meet you in.
Thank you, Rachel. That's really important. Now, there's a quote I really like that I often think about when I'm dealing with a range of different audiences, and it's speak the truth but not to shame. And I think it's that kind of having that, I love, yeah, try and hold that in my head. So I think this is a question actually for all of you. I don't know if Gary maybe want to pick it up first, but often we're all being asked for evidence. So this speaks to that point about being kind of facts and knowledge based. So how do we do this? Obviously every situation is different. So how do we balance up the taking systems based approach with this the kind of the new public management model that Gary talked about and this need for evidence? Start, Gary?
Well, yeah, so there are a couple of things. The first thing is all the evidence says new public management in human systems makes everything worse for everybody. So there's virtually no evidence supporting the paradigm. It was essentially a choice that was made, and it's not like this in other countries. Other countries don't have that paradigm. They have different models. So you know, in that sense, the evidence is on our side. And actually, I would argue anyone who works in a highly target-driven, market-driven human system instinctively knows it's not working. But one of the things that we are developing, and because actually Plymouth is leading a lot of this work, there was a question in the chat about how are you changing Plymouth Council's culture. Well, actually Plymouth Council culture is changing kind of system by system, and that is understanding value. what we've historically focused on is measurement of targets and, you know, hierarchies of evidence. But when you speak to people, you get a much greater sense of what value is, because very often you can hit the target and completely miss the point. And actually in our work in green spaces, we find lots of the casualties of people systems that have failed people. So the group of carers for disabled children and disabled relatives you find in Central Park, what you find is they're there because they didn't reach a threshold, and yet they you know, here they are using green space in a really kind of they really value the green space, they derive value from the green space, they contribute value to the green space. The huge numbers of people with mental illness that we see in green spaces who are effectively, again, they don't reach a threshold, and they feel kind of alone and abandoned, and yet they derive great value from green space. So it's not just about evidence, it's also about a reappreciation of value and how we understand value. And essentially the method is you could characterize it as storytelling. I mean, I talked about appreciative inquiry, you can talk about qualitative research, but it's essentially about listening to people telling you their story in a really open and positive way. And they tell you stuff you would never have thought to ask. They tell you what's important. When you talk to coalface staff, they tell you how to do things more efficiently. So what councils are often really interested in is saving money, because we've had such kind of savage cuts in the last decade. And actually, if you talk to people, they tell you how. So, you know, if I go back to the group of carers that congregate in Central Park every day, I mean, with my old hat on, I might have said, well, this is a peer support group, and maybe we need a service for them. But actually, they don't see themselves as a peer support group. They see themselves as friends, and they don't need a service. But there are some things we could do. You know, we might have another toilet with a hoist, or we might put in a kind of roof space so they didn't get wet when it rained. But we don't have to think about providing a service for them. They're a functional unit. What we have to do is understand the value and see how we can help them to get on with it. Similarly, we've found, I mean, you know this, that if you engage people in a green space, they may start litter picking for you. If they feel a sense of ownership of that space, if they feel that you're listening to them in that space, they are much more likely to pick up their dog mess and to pick up their litter, which saves us money. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Claire. I don't know if Morag and Rachael had any more thoughts on that kind of that tension between this ask for evidence. Right, Morag.
Well, I'm just sorry, go quickly then. I think the thing that was most revealing to me around this was the revelation when I used to talk to, when I was at the council in Cornwall, so I had various colleagues, as Gary's talking about, that our economic development colleagues would reveal that economists are often working on relatively, what's the word? Contestable evidence, shall we say. Its robustness is not what it might look like when you see the numbers presented. So that made me realise that the evidence that we had on an environmental side was actually very much more robust and solidified. But because on an environmental side, we often go, well, we need more, that we are undermining the confidence that we have in our evidence. But actually it's very strong. So I think that would be my observation. Don't believe that everybody else's evidence is better than your own. Really value what you've got and see how far you can get with it. It works for economists, put it that way.
Okay, well, as I said at the very beginning there, one of the reasons that natural change started in the first place is because we realised that evidence really wasn't cutting it. I mean, we had peer-reviewed scientific evidence gathered over years and it still didn't make a difference. So one of the key things that's always been important for me, if someone keeps demanding evidence of you, do a little bit of thinking into why, and you will often find that fear lies at the bottom of it. They are too scared to make a decision until they have a huge bridge of evidence to take you from where you are to where you're going. And this is where sustainability becomes problematic. There is no roadmap. There is no set of instructions of how we make our society sustainable. And this is one of the things that we've looked at is one of the key challenges of sustainability leadership is this thing that Rachael said, it's this step into the dark, it's having the confidence to speak up and speak out. However, one of the things I would completely agree with Gary, one of the methods that we found extremely powerful around these things like natural change, where gathering evidence can be a bit of a challenging thing, there is an approach called most significant change, which was developed by Oxfam, because they could measure their work in terms of, we spent this much money, we built this many wells, we created this many health centres and schools, but they couldn't answer, did that actually make anybody's life any better? And they developed this approach to do it. And actually I found most significant change where you gather people's stories and then you can generate metrics out of that to have been far more powerful. And actually, again, going back to what Rachael said, one of the things I've done very much since my natural change experience, and I've been doing it for over 10 years now, is I am now far more willing to speak from the heart and genuinely share, to use the slightly strange term, share my truth with other people without shame, without feeling the need to edit it or make it socially acceptable. And I have actually found that to be a very powerful piece of evidence to employ in the discussions that I've had.
Great. Thank you very much, Morag. I think, again, it's that tension, isn't it, of taking a different cultural approach. How do we try something new? How do we take a risk? How do we innovate? How do we experiment and learn, like Gary said, from the successes and failures in when we're often operating in a culture that talks about it, but then suddenly panics and is actually quite risk averse. So it's, yeah, how you chart that line, and that going back, I think a lot of this is going back to those values, those stories, that kind of personal human connection that I think you're right, we do. It's a really good reminder about how you do need to be brave. You know, there is a lot of bravery in that, about sort of trying to hold that line and be open and try a new approach. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all our speakers today. I feel like perhaps I've connected with some of this stuff before, but it's been a really powerful reminder and a really inspiring reminder, and a kind of reminder of where Green Minds came from and where we want to go with it. So thank you all for that. And thank you all for coming along to listen and also share your questions. We will be following up after this with recordings, as well as some kind of call to action too. I just want to say thank you as well to the colleagues that have been working a bit in the background to make sure all the kind of tech and the event attendance went smoothly. So thank you. We're just still getting used to this online world. It is inspiring that we have got a lot of great work already happening in Plymouth and across the UK that we can learn from, you know, build a strong platform to go forward with. And I think Green Minds is this opportunity to kind of pull that collaboration together for the city of Plymouth, so for the nature in the city, but for the people that live and work here as well. So this really does feel like the start. It's not, this is just the beginning. So there's 2 more events in our launch series in Green Minds. We've got a final webinar led by Real Ideas organisation next week on Tuesday to find out what our nature-based enterprises are up to in Plymouth. That's EcoBiz, so please join up for that. And we'll be in Central Park actually tomorrow as part of our Living Lab event with the University of Plymouth, looking at how we look at our wildlife sensing, revealing the hidden nature in the park. So come along, 10 till 12. You can drop into our socially distant, COVID secure activities. So that's great. And finally, we'll also share a slide. We're just launching our website this week and our social media work. So I'll pop that slide up for you to all have a look at and have a nose at and find out more. But like I said, this is the start. We're going to be following up with opportunities to get involved and connect. So please do get in touch, and we look forward to seeing and working with you all soon. Thank you.